I'm going to just admit one little thing before I start. I was together with an official of the Government of Canada at a previous Metropolis conference in Sydney, and we looked at one another. We said, we could do this in Canada, couldn't we? Yeah, we should do this in Canada. And that kind of started the ball rolling. So I suppose I earned the consequence. You could call it a reward, you could call it a punishment of trying to think through, after all that has happened, what have we achieved? Where have we come to? I think it was great that the title of the conference had the word promise in it. And what I'd like to do is think a little bit, not about the promise of migration, but the promise of Metropolis and the promise of this conference, and whether we've achieved that promise. And I think the first thing to take note of is, what's the promise? The promise is that we get to talk together, and especially we get to talk across our sectoral specificities. We get people in policy, policy analysis, policy making, able to talk to people in academic research, able to talk to people who execute policies, people who actually do the practice of welcoming newcomers to societies, of advocating for diverse individuals, and so on. So Metropolis then is supposed to create this space for and of respectful dialogue. And as Ambassador Camacho reminded us, dialogue builds trust. So did we do that? Have we kind of achieved some of that, at least over the last 5 days? And of course, no single meeting is ever going to solve the problems of the world and the problems of migration. But did we get closer to where we need to be? And in order to kind of assess that, I thought I would just try to pull one insight that really moved me from each of the plenaries, less than 1 minute each. I know I'm between you and your lunch and so on, so I'll be as efficient as I can. But I also want to stress the fact that these insights come from the interweaving of voices, right, across that policy, practice, and research set of actors. So we started on the first day with 2 plenaries. One of them was on the quest for global governance. And it seems to me, if we think about the broad message of that plenary session, we get a really interesting kind of complex balance that we have to think about. On the one hand, obviously, we need more global coherence. We need more global protection for people who are vulnerable, people who are moving through migratory systems. But at the same time, we were reminded in that plenary that if we have complete coherence, if we have a completely perfect, hermetically sealed global system, we're going to lose out on human ingenuity, human creativity. One of the things that I remind my colleagues in the Canadian government from time to time, if you manage the border perfectly, and if every other country manages the border perfectly, could we still have an asylum system in the world? Asylum systems kind of depend on a bit of porosity in borders. So be careful what we wish for. Don't wish for perfection. The second one dealt with South-South migration. And here, we've all known this. We've all known just how much of the responsibility of protection is taken by developing countries. But we got a potent example of what that looks like in especially the presentation from our colleague from Ecuador. Here is a country that is itself experiencing many development challenges, and yet it is taking on over 200,000 in the net number, over 200,000 migrants from Venezuela, and incorporating them into the society, building regularization programs, giving people the right to work, and so forth. And I thought that was a huge challenge to people like me who come from affluent countries who live in relative comfort, to think, well, if Ecuador can do it, why can't we do more on this? And I was reminded so forcefully in that plenary by one of my favorite quotations of all time, by Nelson Mandela, who said, "Things are always impossible until they happen." We could make these kind of things work, as Angela Merkel, of course, demonstrated in Germany. Then, second day, we turned to a plenary on the economic impact of migration, and I thought that plenary illustrated so forcefully the fact that after mountains of research, huge amounts of effort, we still have unanswered questions. We still have trouble reaching a kind of coherent view of what migration does to the economies of receiving states. But at the same time, there was one consensus that emerged out of that session, which I think is an extremely important one, and that is that the political backlash against immigration that we see everywhere in different parts of the world has no economic justification. It's simply an irrational kind of response from an economic point of view. Of course, there's other reasons why it's happening. Then we had a plenary, I think for the first time at a Metropolis conference, on non-state actors and their role in the migration system. And here I think it's important to lay out the context for a second on why non-state actors are so important. One piece of that context is the fact that we have a huge delinkage between what's happening in terms of political systems and economic systems. There was a wonderful cartoon that was up at some point during that session that had somebody at the US-Mexico border with a come on and stop sign at the same time. And that's the political system says, don't cross the border. The economic system says, hey, we got a job for you. Could you just do this one thing for us? And as long as we have that kind of mixed set of messages, in fact, contradictory set of messages, this leaves tremendous scope for non-state actors to enter into the migratory system. That is also amplified by the fact that our immigration policies, programs, laws have become so complicated, so difficult to navigate, that too leaves open lots of possibilities for a system, and a system that is very lucrative, a system that creates massive amounts of profit from the migration in the world. Then we moved on to the next day on another couple of plenaries. One, again, first time for a Metropolis conference on internally displaced populations. And I think here again we saw something really inspiring, which was the wonderful example we had of unarmed civilian protection and the kinds of work that people are doing through their own voluntary activities that they are obviously taking out of a sense of solidarity and exercising enormous courage. We should think more about how these kinds of things develop. Then we had yet another kind of first for Metropolis, a plenary that dealt with the relationship between technology and migration. And Umit Kiziltan asked us at the beginning a wonderful question: Are we in 2019 or are we in 1984? And we looked at what the relationships are between technology and migration. We looked at it from the point of view of migrants, from the point of view of states, and from the point of view of political mobilization. And of course, that was a very sobering set of insights in that particular plenary. I think the important message of that one is we're not going to turn the clock back. We have to engage with these issues, and I think that the plenary at this conference should open up a much longer-term conversation we have on that issue of the role of technology in migration. Finally, today, we got another couple of plenaries, two that were very close to my own heart as we talked about the plenary structure in the organizing committee. The first was on cities and migration, and this, of course, realizes in some sense the idea of what Metropolis was invented to do, which was to think about the relationship between migrants and cities. That's why it's called Metropolis. So we had a plenary that dealt with that exact theme. And I think, again, I was scribbling notes as fast as I could this morning, so bear with me. I haven't quite processed today's plenaries in as quite as thorough a way as I've had a chance to for the previous days. But there I was really struck by the challenges of inclusion, the continuing challenges of inclusion, the fact that we have to actively build societies that respect all members, that allow all people to utilize their potential and make contributions, and that the city scale is likely the place where that is best built, where we can best kind of address that particular challenge. And of course, it takes the engagement of all three of those sectors, of policy, of practice, and of research to make that happen. Finally, we just finished a plenary on public confidence in migration. Again, something that I really wanted to hear and was rapidly scribbling notes. What I take away from that first point is we've got massively mixed feelings, massively mixed audiences out there. No country is devoid of racism, is devoid of xenophobia. It just has different mixes of these things, different configurations of these things. And what that really challenges us to do, it seems to me, is to broaden our message. There's such an easy tendency to keep speaking to each other. It's wonderful to speak to each other. It's affirming to speak to each other. But at the end of the day, our message only really matters if it reaches beyond our bubbles, beyond our communities, and into those places where people are skeptical. What we really have to try to do is change the minds, or help to change the minds of people who don't see the advantages of migration and diversity. I also wanted to make one other point. I was sitting with an American friend and colleague who I've met through these conferences, and he whispered something really important in my ear. When we were hearing the talk about the kind of Canadian, almost not quite consensus on migration being, or immigration being a good thing for the country and so forth, he whispered in my ear, yeah, that's what we thought in the United States before 2016. It's a fragile consensus. It's never going to be a consensus that is enduring unless we make it enduring. So we've seen how public attitudes can switch very dramatically in that particular instance. All right, so I've got 2 minutes left, and I'm going to finish in 2 minutes. Enrico will be happy at least with that. I'm a glass half full kind of person. I tend to be an optimist, so what is my optimism? How does that intersect with this conference? It seems to me there's some really great things that happen through this conference and through the continuing Metropolis process and project, if you want to call it that. And again, I just come back to that point, first of all, about the interweaving of policy, of research, and of practice, and just how potent that is as a combination for gaining better understanding of the things that we care about. First point. Second point, the growing diversity of voices. The panels had much more diversity on them than Metropolis had 5 years ago, 10 years ago, especially 15 and 20 years ago. And I think that's to the credit of the organizers. It's also, it just reflects who we need to hear from in these conferences. And we will, I'm sure, we'll do even better, and I'm going to suggest one more voice that we haven't heard from so much in the conferences. We've done great, I think, especially in Sydney and Vancouver, in acknowledging the importance of First Peoples, but we haven't yet learned their wisdom when it comes to issues of contemporary society. So it's another set of voices I think we need to really build on that diversity. But my last point is, what I'm especially pleased about at these conferences is the fact that I don't know so many people at these conferences. There's always new people, and especially there's a lot of young people in the participants of this conference, and that just gives me a huge amount of optimism about the future. And in my last 30 seconds, I will just say, I think, therefore, we can declare this a successful conference and a very good investment by the Canadian government and the Canadian people in hosting the conference. And now my time is up, and I'm happy to leave the stage and let you enjoy your lunch.